The movie opens in Greece in 1987 at the 10th birthday party of a young girl. Her grandfather then puts a pendant bearing an ancient philosopher on her neck and gives her another one as well. He tells her to share the second pendant with the one she loves most, to which the girl excitedly agrees. The scene then cuts to 20 years later in 2007, where we see a girl named Cleo who is celebrating her birthday with her best friend Dana and their respective boyfriends. The two girls then head to the restroom where we see Cleo wearing the same pendant featuring the ancient philosopher. After some dancing and having fun, Cleo's boyfriend Manthos insists they must leave as he has something important to tell her. The couple thus says goodbye to their friends and proceeds to depart on a motorcycle. After driving for a while, they stop on the side of a road where Manthos takes this moment to propose to his girlfriend for marriage. Cleo is also overwhelmed with happiness and accepts his proposal without hesitation. But then, all of a sudden, the scene then cuts to New Year's Eve of 2015, where we see a criminology professor named Dmitry Laine teaching about criminal psychology. After the class, Dmitry meets with a chancellor who is also the head of the university. The chancellor asks with whom he is going to celebrate the new year, and Demetrius reveals it. It will be his father, as he's the only family he has left. This makes the chancellor a bit sad, and he says it was unfortunate what happened to his dad. Sometime later, Dimitri arrives at a hospital where his dad has been in a comatose state for a while due to an accident. Dimitri decides to stay with him all night while outside everyone is enjoying and celebrating the new year. Elsewhere, we see a woman named Christina de Sela who arrives at her building and notices that the elevator is out of order, so she decides to go up the stairs. But then, Christina is severely injured in her head and bleeds to death, while the killer removes the out of order sign from the elevator and leaves. The next morning, as Dimitri leaves the hospital in his car, he hears on the radio that the former judge Christina de Sela was found dead a few hours ago. The police have ruled it an accident, stating the victim must have slipped on the staircase and died. In another scene, we see a doctor named Alexius Papas working alone in his office late at night, so he rushes to check the door but doesn't find anyone. Dr. Papas returns to his desk unaware that someone has just slipped inside, and then suddenly the killer plunges a knife into his hand before brutally slashing his throat. The killer then turns a page in the notebook, which reveals that the date is January 4th. The next morning, Dmitri wakes up to a call from the chancellor, who tells him that a doctor was found brutally murdered just a few hours ago. He says that the deputy commander of the homicide department is a close friend of his and has reached out to him. The chancellor then asks Dmitri to help the police, emphasizing that his expertise in criminology could be valuable in the investigation. Sometime later, Dmitri arrives at the crime scene and meets the police deputy chief, Apostolos. Dmitri notices Dr. Papa's lifeless body and sees a quote written on the floor that reads, "Say what you should and don't listen to those you shouldn't." The police reveal that the killer had cut the doctor's throat and fingers before using his blood to write the code. Another bizarre detail is that they found an envelope containing 220 euros in the doctor's pocket. After writing everything in his notes, Dimitri returns home and searches for information about Dr. Papas on the internet, but he finds nothing. The next morning, he meets with Apostolos at the station and says that, based on the nature of the murder, this appears to be a calculated act of revenge rather than a crime of passion. They also discuss that the 220 euros found in the doctor's pocket must have been placed there by the killer, as it wasn't bloodstained and it likely carries a symbolic meaning such as bribery. In the following days, Dmitri continues to work on the case while also teaching at the university and taking care of his father. A few days later, he meets with Apostolos, who reveals that they have interrogated many people in the doctor's case, but came up empty handed. They also couldn't find anything in the doctor's files, nor did DNA testing produce any leads. Dmitri then points out that the ancient quote was actually by Pythagoras, which could indicate the killer's high level of education. A few days later, we see a hotel employee arriving at a room to clean. but her eyes widen in horror when she notices a bloodied man lying dead in her bed, with another Pythagoras quote written on the wall that says, "He buries gold who hides the truth." Shortly after, Dmitri receives a call about this murder from Apostolos, prompting him to immediately rush to the crime scene. They find out that the dead man's name is Demosthenes and he was a lawyer. A medical officer explains that the killer must have some background in anatomy and surgery based on the precision with which the victim's tongue was cut off. There's also a small syringe puncture on the victim's neck, revealing that the killer administered anesthesia before murdering him. Later, Apostolos tells Dmitri that based on the Pythagoras code, it looks like this is the same killer as before, but Dmitri says this is not the only similarity and shows him room number 220, which appeared in the previous case as well. After some time, the autopsy results arrive, and Apostolos informs Dmitri that the victim's tongue was cut out after being drugged, and he died from excessive bleeding. Dmitri theorizes that perhaps this murder was committed by a female killer and she must have lured the man into the hotel room. They carefully analyze the code, and Apostolos mentions that he recalls another death involving an ancient Greek code, but in that case, the victim had taken his own life. Next, Apostolos calls his subordinate and asks for the file on a man named George Efthymiou. It turns out that George, who was a Class 6 graduate, had hanged himself, and his ex wife mentions that he had been struggling with depression. Dmitri examines the pictures from the case and notices another Greek code that says, "All are destined to die." When Dmitri asks when he died, Apostolos reveals that the maid found him in the morning of January 2nd. However, Dmitri points out the victim's watch stopped exactly at 2:20, which suggests that he was also murdered by the same serial killer. Just then, Dmitri receives a call from the hospital and he rushes there, only to learn that his father has suffered a severe stroke. The doctor explains that his father is now on life support and that they will remove it if Dmitri orders. It is for the best as they are only prolonging the suffering of the man who will never recover. But Dmitri firmly refuses to let that happen and wants to keep his father alive at all costs. Days later, Apostolos meets with the chancellor and inquires about Dmitri, who hasn't been communicating with him lately. The chancellor informs him about Dmitri's father's condition and reveals how he was run over by a car years earlier. It turns out that the driver fled after abandoning him and went unpunished, while the poor man has been suffering ever since. Sometime later, Dmitri continues investigating all the murders and meets with Apostolos to share his findings. He says that the killer is punishing all these people for something. Dmitri reveals that while investigating the Demosthenes online, the former judge Christina's name also came up. It turns out the two were accused of trial fixing in more than 30 cases, including blackmail, murder, and drugs. Apophis mentions that Christina died in an accident after falling down the stairs, but Dmitri doesn't believe it was actually an accident. He also finds it strange that despite her old age, she took the stairs that day. Following this, the two decide to visit the apartment where Christina used to live before she died. Upon their arrival, they board the elevator, but on the first floor, Dmitri notices something written on the wall. It turns out to be another ancient Greek code that says everything happens according to the number. One is the beginning of everything. Furthermore, the elevator has 220 kg capacity written on it, which proves that the former judge's death wasn't an accident but murder. The next morning, Dmitri meets with the chancellor and shares that four murders have taken place, with Pythagoras codes left at all the crime scenes along with the number 22. He admits that he doesn't know how to move forward, so the chancellor tells him about the French mathematics professor, Marcel, who has extensive knowledge of Greek history. It turns out Marcel will be the keynote speaker at an upcoming conference at the university, so this will be the perfect opportunity to meet him. The scene then cuts to the conference where Professor Marcel is seen giving a speech. Afterwards, Dmitri approaches him and states that he was sent by the chancellor. He explains that he's been working on a criminal case involving frequent Pythagorean codes and the number 220 and asks for his help in understanding what it means. The professor then writes on the board "hetero ego," which means the other me. He explains that the hetero-ego concept was known to the Pythagoreans in relation to amicable numbers where each number is considered the other self of the other, for example, 220 and 284. To achieve this, the sum of the proper divisors of one number equals the other number. Marcel even shows an example and lists the proper divisors of 284. When he adds them up, the total comes to 220, which leaves Dmitri stunned. Elsewhere, we see Apostolus visiting a man named Euphemio, the father of George, who was found hanging. The man begins to talk about his son and says he was a good person but chose to surround himself with the wrong people. He recounts how George had been involved in an accident and how everything changed for him after that, sending him into a deep depression. Hearing this, Apostolus is stunned and begins inquiring about the accident. Later, Dmitri is doing some calculations at his home right when Apostolus arrives and says he has found a case that connects the victims. It is related to the accident from 2007 when a woman named Cleo and the boyfriend Manthos were hit by a car after leaving the club. The driver of the car was Tony Marnelli, the son of a well known industrialist. At the trial, he claimed that the motorcycle driver was responsible for the accident as he was fooling around with his girlfriend. The only eyewitness that night was the co driver, George, who confirmed Marnelli's false claims. In a shocking twist, the defense attorney was Demosthenes, while Dr. Papas was the doctor, who confirmed that Marnellis was not drunk driving. Furthermore, the judge overseeing the case was none other than Christina de Sela, who declared Marnellis not guilty. Upon hearing this, a shocked Dmitri asked what happened to the couple, and Apostolus explains that Cleo was killed on the spot. In her handbag, they found lipstick, 70 euros, a keychain, a cell phone, and a pendant on which 284 was inscribed. This revelation leaves Dmitri stunned, and he immediately begins writing something on the board, just as Apostolus receives a call from someone. After taking the call, Apostolus informs Dmitri that they are late as Marnelis has been missing for the past 24 hours. But Dmitri insists that Marnelis is still alive, and based on the theorem of amicable numbers, the killer plans to murder him on May 22nd. He has exactly divided 284 correspond to the days of the year on which the murders occurred. And when these five numbers are added, the total is 220, linking back to the previous cases. Following this pattern, the killer murdered the judge on the first day of the year, George on the second day, Dr. Papas on the fourth day, and the lawyer on the 71st day, March 12th. The 142nd of day of the year falls on May 22nd, on which the killer is expected to strike Tony Manalis. Dimitri asks about what happened to the motorcycle driver, Manthos, so Apostolus reveals that he was badly injured, but he survived. The police are planning to arrest him, so without wasting any time, Dimitri calls one of his contacts and obtains the address of Manthos' house. Not long after, Dimitri arrives at the address and meets Manthos, who is wheelchair bound and completely disfigured from the accident. Manthos says that he has never been able to forget that night of the accident. It turns out Mandalis ran like a coward instead of helping them, as he was drunk and was worried that his car would get stained with blood. Manthos recalls how Cleo had been studying to become an astrologist and how they had shared so many dreams and hopes for the future. Here, Dmitri asks if he killed those people out of revenge, but Manthos firmly says he didn't. He vents about how he can't do anything and his mom has to care for him like a child. He admits that he hasn't even been able to visit Cleo's grave to leave their flowers, let alone kill so many people. Manthos then requests that if Dmitri finds the killer, he bring that person to him once so he can kiss their hands in gratitude. Upon hearing this, Dmitri proceeds to leave, and outside the home he notices that the police have arrived to interrogate Manthos. The next day, the chancellor scolds him for going to a suspect's house and putting himself at risk. He also suggests that Dmitri might be taking the case personally because of his father's accident, but the latter clarifies that this is not true. Just then, Dmitri receives a call from Apostolus, who urgently summons him, revealing that Marley has been murdered today on May 22nd, just like he predicted. Soon enough, Dmitri arrives at the crime scene and notices the tied up dead body of Maimonides with his chest carved out. Another Greek quote is written nearby that says, "What wrong did I do? What good did I accomplish? What did I forget to do?" One of the medical officers explains that Maimonides had also been anesthetized before his death, and the killer seems to have extensive knowledge of anesthesia since they used different substances for each victim based on the nature of their crime. He also shows a license plate bearing the number 220, which was nailed to the victim's chest. Afterwards, Apostolos informs Dmitri that Manthos has a strong alibi, so they had to rule him out as a suspect. He also thanks the professor for his help with the case and assures him that after checking all the details, they will catch the killer. That night, Dmitri is still haunted by the case and recalls how Cleo had been studying to become an anesthesiologist. The next morning, he goes to visit Cleo's grave and finds a pendant with the number 284 inscribed on it. There is also another ancient Greek quote, "The future is yet to come. I'm still on a dead end." The professor recalls how Manthos says he never visits Cleo's grave, which makes him realize that the pendant must have been left by someone else. That night, Dmitri returns to the graveyard and patiently waits for the culprit. Not long after, a mysterious person wearing a hoodie arrives at Cleo's grave carrying flowers. The person then hangs another pendant on the grave, this one marked with the number 220 and featuring a Pythagoras figure. Dmitri steps closer and asks if they are the one responsible for punishing the people who wronged Cleo. At this moment, the person turns around and it is revealed to be Danai, who turns out to be the same girl from 1987 whose grandfather had gifted her two pendants. She had given the second pendant to her best friend Cleo, who had been the closest person in her life since childhood. It becomes clear that it was Danai who committed all those murders, and she asks Dmitri if he has come to arrest her. She reveals that her grandfather was the mathematician who had given her two pendants on her birthday and taught her about amicable numbers. She had given the other pendant to her best friend Cleo, whom she loved dearly. She explains they went to the same school, attended the same university, pursued the same field of study, and had imagined their whole lives together. However, Danai never imagined that her best friend would leave her so soon, and so she decided to punish all those responsible. A shocked Dmitri speaks to her about the existence of God and the power of forgiveness, but Danai says that she doesn't regret anything and she did what she had to do. Following this, Danai walks away from there while Dmitri heads to the hospital. He tearfully bids farewell to his father and then removes him from life support with a heavy heart. Days later, Dmitri goes to meet the chancellor, who reassures him that he did the right thing for his father. He also gives Dmitri mail that has arrived for him at the university. Upon returning home, Dmitri opens the envelope and finds a locket with the number 1210, which is an amicable number with 1184. It is accompanied by a thank you note from Danai, whom Dmitri chose not to report to the police. There is also a childhood picture of Danai and Cleo, which Dmitri carefully places on his board as the movie comes to an end. As the truth finally comes to light, Dmitri is left alone with the weight of justice, loss, and forgiveness. A story where numbers decide fate and love turns into vengeance comes to a chilling end. If you enjoyed this dark and intelligent thriller, make sure to like the video, subscribe to CineSnap, and turn on notifications for more mind bending movie recaps just like this.